This is Capital Games Movie Club. I am the Wiz.
And I'm Zero.
Zero. How you doing today?
Bit exhausted, but I'm ready to rock on this one.
Nice. Okay. I chose this one this week, and I thought you'd be really interested in this one. This is the 1985 Paul Schrader film, Mishima, Life in Four Chapters, starring Kenagato and directed by Paul Schrader. Paul Schrader. It'd be interesting if Paul Schrader actually directed the movie. Do you know who Paul Schrader is?
Not offhand.
He's the keyboardist for David Letterman. Anyway, that was a strange aside. Sierra, are you aware of who Paul Schrader is?
Not offhand, actually.
Okay. Paul Schrader, before he became a director, he actually was a prolific film writer. The one movie that I think people most know him for is Taxi Driver, the movie that was directed by Martin Scorsese. Excellent screenplay. He's really good in writing and everything, but since I think the 80s, he's gotten his hand in directing. He did movies like American Gigolo, and the most recent one that I think he did was A Card Counter. The last one I saw of his was First Reformed, which a lot of people praised, but I didn't feel so hot about. He's an interesting character himself, but the movie that he's made that gets so much praise from a lot of people is Mishima, A Life in Four Chapters. I thought it would have been an interesting thing to check out, mainly because of your interest in Asian studies and Asian culture. I want to ask you this. I know we've asked this in private, but I want to ask you this in the podcast. Were you aware of who Yukio Mishima was before this movie?
Not offhand, actually.
I read a little bit on this, and very little, because I didn't want to be too surprised. I didn't want to be too spoiled by what the movie was. But the first thing that you learn right away is that apparently no one in Japan wants to talk about Yukio Mishima. is what I've gotten out of it. Like, for instance, this movie still banned in Japan. This was made in 85. Yeah, it's made in 85. Has been released in theaters. Never has been released in theaters. Apparently, you can get the DVD and Blu-ray when you import it, but there hasn't been an official release of the movie, which is kind of why I think the movie pretty much bombed in the box office, because the only place it could have made money was America. And, foreign language films don't usually make a lot of money in America. So that didn't help in that end. I read a little bit about him, essentially, but apparently this guy was a gifted artist to a certain extent, mostly with poetry and writing, which interested me in that end as well. So, did you read a little bit about him before the movie, or did you want to go in blind?
I went in completely blind and only read up on Yukio Mishima's life after watching the movie.
Okay. Oh, that's probably a better idea. I wanted to watch this movie a while ago, and it's just one of those things where you have so many choices that it kind of paralyzes you as to what you can actually decide to watch. So I never got around to it. But I'm glad that I was able to watch this, because this was definitely an interesting one. All right, let's get started with a review of Mishima, A Life in Four Chapters, directed by Paul Schrader. So I want to start by referencing another movie that I love that is also a biography, and it's called I'm Not There. I'm pretty sure you're not aware of this movie, are you?
No.
Okay, so I'm Not There is a film by Todd Haynes. It's about the life of Bob Dylan. But what made that movie unique is that Bob Dylan was played by, I think, at least 15 different actors. And a lot of them was Heath Ledger, Christian Bale. There was a young black child who was playing Bob Dylan in a sense as well. And also Cate Blanchett. And it did a lot of different things in that movie that I really never saw in a biography that I thought was incredibly unique. Watching this movie, I was like, oh, so that's where I'm Not There got the ideas for this. Because I was watching this going, wow, this reminds me of I'm Not There a whole lot. And not that I think it's like a lesser copy. Like, I'm Not There does a lot of different things too that I appreciate, but I can definitely see where the genesis of that idea came from, was watching this movie. Because the unique thing that Schrader does in this movie, I guess highlighting Mishima's life and what he has done, makes it really interesting that most biographies don't do. Because if we go through most biographies, whether about celebrities, politicians, whatever, it usually is the boilerplate, start from the beginning, find a through line to go through the middle of his life, and then to the end, to where you want to end the movie. This movie does do that, but it does it in a very engrossing and unique way, which is it takes his story, but cuts it up throughout the film, and then shows very uniquely shot instances of his work. 3 of his work throughout the movie. I think the 3 of the work was Pavilion of the Golden, or is it? What was the 3? I know one.
Temple of the Golden Pavilion, okay. Kyoko's House, and then Runaway Horses.
Runaway Horses. There we go. Okay, thank you. And the way they're shot is itself really unique and interesting in the way they do, because they look like plays almost. Which, if I recall correctly, Mishima was also he was also a playwright as well. So that was also some interesting aspects to it. What were your thoughts of the visual tableau that was given throughout the movie?
It was very interesting because the parts that are very, very, I guess you could say, almost kind of biographical feeling, they have like a very, very documentary style filming style. And then when you get to the pieces where they explore some of his written works, those feel like a film production of a play, which was very interesting considering that Mishima-san was a writer and a playwright and had a lot of admiration for sort of Western playwrights and just how Western literary culture was.
I really like the visuals of this movie, like specifically. The one that I think stands out to me, even though it's the one that I had to stop watching after a certain point, was Kyoko's house, and that was like towards the end of that scene, because I like the way the colors really stood out throughout that entire section of the movie. But all 3 are like visually distinctive and stunning, which is really hard to do when you're, because the way that they're shot in different colors and in different ways as well. So it was really visually distinctive and very interesting what they did with that. And you're right with the more documentary style feel of Mishima's story in this, because it really feels gritty in that certain sense, the way they shot those sequences, which is really weird to a certain extent when you consider the character, which is Mishima, who basically, I would say he values aesthetics over anything in this, than anything that he believes in. I guess for his story to be the least flattering part of the movie, I thought was kind of strange, but also interesting in that sense. What did you think?
It was just kind of an interesting juxtaposition, because just the 3 stories that they feature center around beauty, eroticism, and death, and those are very, very grand things in literature. And then just you have this juxtaposition where just his life is just very, very, very streamlined. It's not grandiose. It's just completely the opposite. And yeah, I thought it was kind of an interesting juxtaposition that they had.
Let's get into the writing, which is the way the film is. I think with the writing, the way the film is structured is the most interesting part, because the way that Schrader and his co-writers did it, which I think one of them is his brother and his wife, I believe. One of his brother, I know that, but the way that the film is structured has the tendency to have a lot of issues with a less skilled writer and director. I mean, the most famous ones, of course, Pulp Fiction, which does everything out of order, and that's done really well. But other filmmakers and writers have tried this and end up having issues with the film as time goes on. But this film didn't have that issue at all. And it's not like they do things out of order. It's just that they break up the Mishima part with these parts about his writing. When they do that, it still makes sense to a certain extent. Like the way, what I was worried about throughout the entire film was that when they would break up the Mishima parts with his stories, is that there would be a weird kind of break off where they're clearly showing his work, but there's really no connection there. But they still felt like that, even though the connection was kind of hard to, I guess, grasp at a certain point. Like, for example, Kyoko's house. Okay, I think the most visually distinctive of the two, the three I liked. I still have kind of a hard time thinking why that story of any of the other stories that he had that you would choose on this one. Just wasn't entirely sure why they chose Kyoko's house, because I don't really see the connection between his story and the other two that were there. It still didn't feel off with the film.
It was interesting because you start off at an interesting point in Mishima's life in the beginning of the movie, and then right after the prelude of the movie, you jump into the first chapter of his story, which covers Mishima's youth and everything. And on top of covering the days of his childhood, it also goes into discussing his work of the Temple of the Golden Pavilion and everything. So it was kind of interesting to see parts of his life interspersed in each of these chapters as you sort of went along. And I thought on a narrative writing end, it was kind of interesting sort of blending both bits of his personal life with a piece of one of his most lauded works and everything as you went through the movies, or as you went through the chapters and everything.
Okay, so let's get into, I think, performances. It's really hard to actually give a standout performance in this movie because a lot of the performances are really broken up as the movie goes on, but I would say Ken Ogata as Mishima in the movie is actually pretty good, especially towards the end. I think the person who played the main character in Kyoko's house was actually very good as well. He probably had the most depth in the role that he had in this, so I thought those were two pretty good performances.
Yeah, Ken Ogata as Yukio Mishima, an outstanding performance and everything, especially towards the end of the movie and the last chapter and everything. You can just sort of just feel the passion from how he's depicting Mishima and everything. And Kenji Sawada as Osamu in Kyoko's house, that one, I'll have to go with you on that one too, because that one was really good. Just playing the thespian who decides to get into bodybuilding. Really interesting portrayal to that end. And then for Runaway Horses, Toshiyuki Nagashima as Isao, the kendo student who ends up trying to basically start a civilian militia corps to restore the traditional values of Japan and all that. Just as sort of the leader of the gang, he played a very interesting role in that one. And even though that one sort of goes in very dark places and almost is a prelude to the final chapter.
I'm kind of surprised I'm familiar with Schrader and his work a little bit, but I'm surprised that this movie wasn't as graphic as I was expecting. I guess with nudity it's pretty graphic, but with violence it's not as graphic as I thought it was going to be, even though, let me apologize to you, when I read the IMDb Parents Guide thing where it tells you what's objectionable, it had everything as mild and moderate. And then after I watched it, I was like, no, I don't think any of that was mild and moderate. I don't know how you were affected by the middle part, because the middle part was the one where I was like, ooh, I'm going to have to turn this off a little bit. I don't know if I can handle that.
The middle part got a bit shocking. I mean, as a former healthcare professional, not much shocks me these days.
Yeah.
So it was just kind of like whoa, that went to a dark place.
Yeah, like I was really surprised on that. Overall, like the film is striking in a way, and it does a lot of things differently with biopics that most films just don't do, except for the one that I mentioned. But it was really interesting the way that it was shot and how it was handled. I guess the one complaint that I have a little bit, I don't have much of an interest in the main character that much. Like, and from what I've read about the character of the guy, he seemed really interesting, but he was definitely a political revolutionary to a certain extent, or was he? I'm not even entirely sure. He seems like a really interesting guy that I want to know more of. This movie, after that, I was like, yeah, I think I've had enough. I guess in that sense, I'm kind of a little disappointed, because usually with a really good biopic movie, I want to know more about what they didn't tell you. In this, I was like, yeah, I kind of had enough.
It was partly what kind of drove me to kind of read up a little bit more about him after the end, especially with just the political piece, because there was a bit of a spicy joke that I made in PMs with you on Discord about the messaging of the movie. So might be a little too spicy for YouTube or wherever this podcast may go.
Yeah. Let's get into spoilers from Mishima, Life in 4 Chapters. If you have not watched it, you can turn it off, come back when you're ready. We'll get started in spoilers in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's a lot that we can talk about with this. I don't know where we can get started. Do the filmmakers agree with Mishima?
In my opinion, I felt that the movie didn't over-dramatize things. It kind of presented just a very, very, I guess you could say, dry textbook presentation of who Yukio Mishima was as a person. This could have been something easily just hyper-exaggerated, especially just with the political messaging that Mishima is all about. I think this movie did a fairly good job of portraying Yukio Mishima in sort of a balanced manner, not hyper-exaggerating details, just sticking with the fact that, just this was who he was. These were some of his lauded works that were read by many and critically acclaimed by people around the world, and that's kind of what I got out of it.
Why do you think Schrader decided to do the biopic this way instead of a standard biopic? Do you think that the person himself personally wasn't as interesting than his ideas and his work was? Like, what do you think was the reason that he decided to do it the way he did?
I think partly it is to do with the wife of the director, or the wife or the sister-in-law of the director, because she is Japanese and was likely the bridge to the people who now run Yukio Mishima's literary estate. So I think that's part of the reason why it wasn't so overly hyper-exaggerated, and it was just kind of very cut and dry. But that's my opinion on the matter.
I look at this film, and it's one of the best examples I can see of separating art from artist. The film does celebrate the art that he made, but I feel that the film, to a certain extent, criticizes him for how he was. Like, they show him in a lot of different times and eras and how he was throughout the film, and it's more like, I guess it shows his contradictions. Maybe it's not criticizing him, but it definitely shows his contradictions. A lot of films that are biopics don't like to do, unless that person is fine with people knowing his contradictions or her contradictions. We just don't know that about Mishima, but this film does show like a lot of his contradictory sides. Like, for example, he seemed like a free-loving, sexually open person, but then for him to end the way he did, with the thought process that he did, was really weird. I'm like, wait a minute. You were very counterculture at a certain point in time here, but then you went from there to what now? Like, bring back the emperor? What?
Yeah, bring back the emperor. Western decadence has corrupted our society. We must start a corps of civilian militia to reinstate the morals of traditional Japan. It was just kind of like a wild 180. It was just like, whoa, so that's a very, very, very drastic 180. In the beginning, you were just fascinated by Western literature, Western poetry, Western theater, and even obsessed with Western art, like the painting of Guido Reni's Saint Sebastian, who's like tied up and stuck with a bunch of arrows and everything. And just, you go from that to reject modernity, embrace tradition, and it's just like, wow, holy shit.
A part of me wants to know what led him to that, to a certain extent, but then would the film be, I think the film would be much different if they went and turned around and try and piece together what went from him being, I would say, a more progressive person to then becoming a much more traditionalist person, I guess isn't the way to put it. I think the subtext is in between the three stories, because a lot of the film, that the stories that he chose, it is strange. It is breaking down what people's expectations are in regards to certain aspects of society, not just Japanese society, but society as a whole. First off, beauty. The fact that the main character in the first story wanted to destroy something he found so beautiful. And then the second one was, I guess, love in a certain way. I mean, the character, the main character, I don't think doesn't love anybody, but he finds a way to find love in his specific way, even though it is incredibly self-destructive. And then the third one is the political aspects as a whole, and why that political aspect needs to be destroyed in its wake as well. So the fact that he has three stories bent on, I would say, destruction, to then have the end of his life being that he kills himself in order to bring back the emperor. I forget what the style of government is. For that was like, that's really weird, but I guess there is sort of a through line between the three stories.
There's definitely a through line. It's definitely on the subtle side of showing just his change in values as his works progressively went on through his life and everything. Because I believe Runaway Horses was towards the latter years of his life.
Yeah, I think all of them were done in like order of the way they were published. They have the year of which they were published throughout.
So I think that's kind of where just it sort of breaks down how his values change. It's definitely on the subtle side. So I mean, it's not kind of like boom in your face. This was the moment that he turned completely conservative to wanting a traditional government where the Japanese emperor ruled and all this other stuff.
So do you think this is a story about political idealism? To me, this is a very multi-layered story, which makes it more fascinating to talk about and to think about. But talking about it now, he went from one extreme to the other. Is this a cautionary tale about political extremism, or is it, do you have an interpretation yourself of the movie?
I think in my mind, I just see this as sort of just a story of a writer. It's sort of showing some of the most significant vignettes in his life. And then, of course, the final vignette being something that's more grounded in the real world rather than being focused on one of his literary works. And I definitely agree that it just definitely seems much more multifaceted. This is going to be something that I'll likely have to just kind of watch again and everything, mostly because it does fascinate me and everything. But at the same time, just I don't think it's kind of easy to just sort of sum up in one thing. And I know I joked about just my summary about it with you via PM, but for the non-spicy version, I joked and said something that was essentially what boiled it down to was reject modernity and embrace tradition. Because just towards the end, he gets very, very heavy into the whole, I think Japan's losing its soul. We've got to do something about the rampant immorality, the materialism. I think it's just destroying Japanese society. It sort of blends bits and pieces of just the last novel that they discuss, Runaway Horses, is sort of into the fold as well, too.
You just think it's like a multifaceted film? There's no like direct message that the filmmaker is getting across here, or is there even an accidental message?
Honestly, I don't think so. I think there's just a lot to unpack in this movie.
Yes, no, absolutely. That's I think one of the best things about this movie is that you can get multiple interpretations of what's going on. And what the filmmaker, well, not even just the filmmaker thinks, but what the film that you think it should be about in this. And I love films like this. A movie I reviewed recently, Tar, did this as well. There are multiple people who think multiple different ways about that movie. But what the beauty of Tar, and I think the beauty of this film, is that unless the take that someone has is really crazy, there really isn't a wrong take that you can have in this, because there's going to be evidence to what people think it is. And I think that's the mark of a really well-written, really well-made film. I believe this one definitely is. Even though with Schrader's films, I haven't been particularly a fan, but this one is excellent. I really like this. This was really good.
It was kind of interesting just them going into these three pieces of his work, which were apparently some of his most acclaimed works and everything. The Temple of the Golden Pavilion was kind of an interesting story, and especially since it seemed to have what felt like some details of Mishima's younger years, and then just sort of blended into the movie, or the movie-like production of the book being depicted and everything. And then Kyoko's house, it almost seems like maybe depicting Mishima's life in his 20s or 30s in some respects, in a very hyper stylized and very fictional sort of way, but just felt like that there were parts of his life that were in there just in a completely sort of fictional sort of way. The last story, Runaway Horses, that one definitely seemed to have a sort of echoes of just his later years in life and everything, especially with the whole like wanting to overthrow the new government that was coming into power and to try to go back to the olden days of samurai honor and the emperor.
What is your favorite segment of the four? Because there's four. There is the final one, which shows him committing seppuku, and then there are the three based on his works. What is your favorite segment?
Honestly, I thought it was Runaway Horses, mostly because just it deals with the concept of youth and sometimes the fact that youthful nativity can completely misunderstand purity, especially the second to final scene for Runaway Horses, where the main character Isao and his gang get caught by the authorities and they're all thrown into jail, and he's being interrogated by the prosecutor, I'm guessing, in the jail, basically asking him, why on earth would you plot to overthrow the government? You've got a bright future ahead of you. You know, you're a very accomplished kendo student as well too. Why throw everything away just for this insane ideal of purity? And then pretty much just the young Isao basically is just like, if it's not pure, it's worthless, because, you know, just purity is, as the word states, pure. There's no imperfections. There's no concept of compromise. It's just exactly what it is. And of course, the prosecutor's just kind of like, sometimes purity isn't all that it's cracked up to be, essentially. And then, of course, just Isao, being still a child, doesn't understand this. He's just like, well, that's because you're an adult. You've gone soft. You no longer know what purity is anymore because you've gone soft as a man. And then, of course, the prosecutor's just like, you know, just one day you're going to learn that, you know, purity isn't as perfect and as rosy as you think it is.
Yeah. Let me get into a random question before we get into our final thoughts. How would you feel if the narrator was an English-speaking person? when you watch this?
As a polyglot, it would not be a job I'd want. Mostly because of the fact that just with language, when you translate something, there's always something lost in translation. Mm-hmm. That's just the way how language works. I know this as a person who fluently speaks Vietnamese, who has a decent grasp of Japanese, a beginner's grasp at Korean, a pretty decent grasp of both Mandarin and Cantonese Chinese. And I've had to translate stuff between these languages, and every time I translate from one language to another, there's always something lost in translation. That's just the fact of the matter. I know some people say, well, all you just need is a pure translation. Yeah, I mean, you can have a machine translate it with how we've got ChatGPT and other machine learning AIs doing translations. Yeah, sure, you can have them do it, but there are just some words and some concepts that do not neatly translate to another language. So I think an English narrator would maybe end up having to take shortcuts just to make some of the narration work. But that's kind of my opinion as someone who speaks multiple languages and understands multiple languages.
Well, the original release of this movie had an English narrator.
Interesting.
The narrator was Paul Schrader. He was the guy who was in Jaws. I don't have any information as to why they chose this, but my guess is that Warner Brothers, after realizing they just spent $5 million on this movie, they weren't going to get their money from Japan, basically said, okay, we need something for the American audience to latch onto, because, again, foreign language movies just don't sell. So they hired Roy Schrader to actually do the narration. And I think this is how it originally released. After that, I think it's after the Criterion version. I'm not entirely sure, because everywhere else, the Ken Ogata did the narration. But here specifically was Roy Schrader. When you buy the Criterion version, I have that. You get both versions. But the main version that Schrader wants you to watch is the Ken Ogata version. I think you're right, though. Well, the thing with languages, and the thing I've noticed with films specifically, especially with translations, and with games as well, is that a direct one-to-one translation doesn't entirely mean you understand exactly what's going on. It just means that you're just directly translating what they said word for word. But without the cultural subtext and the things behind the language and what it means to the people that is behind it, you just don't completely understand what is being said. But of course, this movie is subtitled, so you have to rely on the person to translate it as best as possible. I think you're absolutely right. It is better to have, I think, the subtitles and the narration to be of its native language, specifically. I was afraid when I was watching this, oh no, is this going to be all in English? Because I don't think Paul Schrader... Because Paul Schrader doesn't know any other languages that I know of. But then I watched Luciano Visconti's The Leopard 5 months ago. And that was dubbed in Italian, but all the actors spoke different languages. That worked. So I was like, okay, this could work. But it was good to see that it was in the native language. So I think they would have been really weird if this was all in English. You want to get into final thoughts?
Yeah, sure.
All right, go ahead.
If you're into the idea of just a biopic that's also a bit on the long and narrative side, then this one should be one to consider, especially since just the written style that Mishima uses in his works, especially the first two, The Temple of the Golden Pavilion and Kyoko's House. There's just sort of an interesting style to it, but the entirety of the movie focuses on the three central themes in Mishima's life, which are beauty, death, and eroticism. And Schrader actually treats the subject matter of Yukio Mishima and his works with a level of gravity and respect, other than the homosexual dancing thing, which the Mishima estate apparently disagreed with him on, so jury's out on that. I would say this one would probably sit at a solid 80% for me.
Right. I mean, we're in agreement. I'm at a 4 out of 5 stars on this. I think this was a very interesting, very well done biopic. The different things that Schrader did shooting these segments is really good. I was captivated throughout, even though I had to stop the movie at a certain point to just collect myself. I thought it was a fascinating movie. I just think that these movies, though, as soon as they're over, if they're really good, you'd want to learn more about the person. And after that, I was kind of like, I think I've had my fill. It's like, I think I'm okay. It's definitely a movie I want to watch again, just for what they do with not just the subject matter, but how they deal with a person's life and the differences that they do on this as well. I can see myself getting more out of this movie in multiple viewings. So I'm going to give 4 out of 5 stars. It's going to definitely be something that in a few years' time, I'll probably watch again and see if I can get more out of. Very interesting movie. I really like this. We are at the end of the episode, so we're going to get into what we're going to be watching next week. Zero, I gave you the choice, and you chose something that I haven't seen in a while, but I'm definitely looking forward to watching. What are we watching next week?
Zhang Yimou's movie Hero, starring Jet Li.
I saw this in the theaters when it came out. This is one of the few movies in the early 2000s that were foreign language films that got a wide release. And I saw this in theaters around that time. I really liked it. I thought it was a beautiful looking movie and the action was really good. So I'm looking forward to this. And I didn't realize this until we discussed it beforehand, but this has a all-star cast here. Of course, that's Jet Li, and it has Zhang Ziyi, who the two are on the cover of the DVDs and Blu-rays. It also has Maggie Cheung, Donnie Yen, and Tony Leung. I was like, oh my god, wow, this is great. These are all the actors that we've been watching for the past year or so. So this is definitely interesting. So I am looking forward to it. Was there a certain reason why you chose this?
It's one of those things that I don't know why, just for this week, just It was one of those movies that just sort of resonated in my head. It was like, you know what you haven't seen in a while? That one. I'm just like, yeah, I haven't seen that one. And then, of course, my mind did slide back into the thought of, it's a damn shame that a lot of the main actors in that movie have become really, really bad Chinese Communist Party shills now.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, Donnie Yen's a big Communist Party shill now. Jet Li's a big Communist Party shill now. Just, it's really fucking sad to see.
On that note, that is it for this episode of Capital Games Movie Club. Tune in next week where we discuss the movie Hero, starring Jet Li, Maggie Cheung, Zhang Ziyi, and Donnie Yen, and Tony Leung. I am The Wiz.
And I'm Zero.
And we'll talk to you next time. Bye.